Hello everyone! I'm back to making neuroscience lectures. Apologies that there was a bit of a gap in my uploading lately. I was in the turbulent season of college applications, and so I was a little bit preoccupied with that. But now that that season is officially past, I will be getting back to uploading neuroscience videos more regularly, so I am excited about that. But today I'm going to be covering sleep, and I'm going to cover sleep in two different types of videos. Today I'm going to be mostly focusing on the actual mechanics of sleep in the brain from a network perspective. However, I also want to devote some attention to brain-based diseases, of which sleep-based disorders will be particularly prominent. So if you're interested in that, look out for a future video that will be covering that. However, before I talk more about the mechanics of sleep in the brain, I want to briefly dive a little bit into the actual cost of sleep debt, because I think we all know vaguely that sleep is important, but I do want to make it very concrete what sleep debt can actually do to your body, especially if it's chronic. So, first, in the brain, I think we've all experienced this before, but when you're tired and you didn't get enough sleep, you tend to have impaired memory, reduced decision-making abilities, and your behavior tends to be a little bit more irrational, and you are more susceptible to mood swings in general. However, especially with chronic sleep debt over time, because your brain doesn't have enough time to remove cellular toxins and do its general repair functions while you're sleeping, that's going to compound over time, and you're going to be at increased risk of things like neurodegenerative disease, as well as various psychiatric conditions like anxiety and depression. Related to the cardiovascular arena, you're also going to be more susceptible to things like hypertension or increased blood pressure, as well as atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries, and these things combined can put you at increased risk for a lot of cardiovascular conditions, including but not limited to coronary heart disease. From a whole body perspective, you are at increased risk of obesity as well as systemic inflammation, and there's going to be reduced amount of time for your immune system to do surveys of your body to get rid of potential pathogens and toxins, and so you're going to find that you have a compromised immune system in cases of sleep debt. Additionally, if you are still growing and you're a minor, if you have chronic sleep debt, then you're going to experience a lack of growth or reduced growth because your body is not going to have enough time to distribute nutrients throughout this rest and repair time, and there's going to be a decreased release of growth hormones. That's another risk of sleep debt. Okay, now I'm going to cover some of the fundamentals of how sleep is actually orchestrated within the brain and the different types of sleep that occur. So sleep occurs in two main phases. There's SWS or slow wave sleep, and there's REM or rapid eye movement sleep. To cover the actual functional differences between SWS and REM phases of sleep, SWS can be thought of as the main rest and repair time in your body. So this is when in the brain, a fluid that surrounds your brain called cerebrospinal fluid or CSF is going to essentially flush the brain of any metabolic waste byproducts that accumulated throughout the day, and it's also going to get rid of any potential pathogens or toxins in the brain. So SWS is very important because it essentially serves as the cleaning time within your brain to get rid of any built-up byproducts or toxins. Additionally, throughout the rest of your body, SWS is going to serve a similar purpose of getting rid of any metabolic byproducts that accumulated as your cells were doing their normal functions throughout the day, and it's going to be important for general tissue repair and muscle repair within your body. REM sleep, however, is a little bit different in what the primary focus of it is. REM sleep is when dreaming is going to occur. It's also when your body is going to focus on transitioning memories throughout the day, whether they're facts that you learned or things that you observed or conversations that you had. Those were put into maybe short-term memory storage, and then during REM sleep, that information, if it's deemed important enough, is going to be transferred into long-term memory storage. So now to cover a little bit more about the intricacies of slow wave sleep versus REM sleep. During slow wave sleep, you're going to have larger cycles or larger durations of slow wave sleep as you are in the early stages of sleep. However, as you get deeper into a period of sleep, there's going to be reduced amounts of slow wave sleep, and the amount of REM sleep that you exhibit is going to increase. And now to talk a little bit more about REM sleep. During REM sleep, as I mentioned before, you are primarily dreaming. Additionally, physically, you're going to experience atonia, and what atonia essentially is it's a loss of muscle tone that leaves you temporarily paralyzed during REM sleep. This doesn't include essential functioning muscles, like for example, the muscles that allow your chest to expand so that you can breathe are not going to be paralyzed, and additionally, the muscles in your eye that are responsible for the rapid eye movement that is very well known during REM sleep are also not going to be paralyzed, but in general, you're going to experience a loss of muscle tone. I'll go ahead and switch over where my face is so that you guys can actually see the slide better. But to continue, the last main difference that I want to cover between SWS and REM actually has to do with the differences in electrical brain activity patterns. And so in neuroscience, there is a tool called electroencephalography, or EEG for short, that uses leads put on the scalp to measure surface level electrical activity in the brain throughout the cerebral cortex. And the reason that that's an incredibly powerful tool is because the electrical activity that occurs in the brain during different periods of sleep will give you a lot of insight into the different ways that neurons fire in the brain and activities organized in the brain during sleep. And so I'll cover very briefly some of the differences between electrical activity in the brain during slow wave sleep and REM sleep. So in slow wave sleep, what's typically observed are higher amplitude but lower frequency brain waves. And so what that means is the peaks and valleys of the brain waves are going to be higher in slow wave sleep, but less cycles of actual brain waves are going to occur per unit time, hence lower frequency brain waves. Meanwhile, in REM sleep, what's especially interesting is that REM sleep electrical brain activity actually looks a startling amount like electrical brain activity while you're wide awake. And so that helps to dispel the common idea that during sleep your brain just sort of quote unquote shuts off. Actually, during REM sleep, especially, but also during slow wave sleep, your brain is very much active and basically awake in many ways. And so that's important during REM sleep, for example, for the consolidation of memories from short-term into long-term. And so just to give you guys some sort of an idea of what REM sleep actually looks like on one of these EEG scanning machines, below, I'll go ahead and zoom in for you guys. You can see that an example of this electrical brain activity is brain waves that are actually very high frequency, and you can see that there's a ton of electrical activity in the brain during REM sleep. So I just wanted to really highlight that for you guys, that your brain is very active while you're in sleep phases. Now I'll do a bit of a deeper dive into the actual mechanics of slow wave sleep. As I mentioned previously, the number of slow waves that you exhibit will decrease the longer that you've been asleep. However, generally speaking, slow wave sleep cycles will occur in 75-minute time periods before you switch off again to REM sleep. I'd like to dive a little bit more into the neurochemistry behind sleep as well, and so a very important neurotransmitter to be familiar with is adenosine. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter that will increase within your brain the longer that you've been awake in order to initiate feelings of fatigue. And this is actually the neurotransmitter that, if you're a big coffee drinker like me, will get blocked by caffeine in order to decrease your perception of feeling fatigued. The more adenosine that you have built up in your brain and the longer that you've been awake, the more slow waves you're going to exhibit upon actually falling asleep. I would also like to dive a little bit more into explaining some of the electrical activity that's exhibited during slow wave sleep. An important general rule is that the more synchronized firing patterns are within your neurons, within your brain, the higher the amplitude or the peaks and valleys of your brain waves are going to be. And so because neuronal activity is so incredibly synchronized in terms of the timing of firing, you have really high amplitude but low frequency brain waves during slow wave sleep. I won't dive too much into it because it's not necessarily important to know, but just an interesting fact is that you can see in this figure on the right, there are a lot of different types of adenosine receptors in the brain, and that just goes to show that the actual coordination and organization of adenosine levels and your energy levels throughout the day is a very complicated pattern within the brain. But if you're interested in looking more into that, I encourage you to look a little bit more into how adenosine receptors actually coordinate with different arousal systems within the brain to determine your circadian rhythms and feelings of fatigue throughout the day. Next, I'll do a bit of a deeper dive into REM sleep. So, in contrast to the 75-minute cycles of slow wave sleep, you're generally going to go into REM sleep in about 10 to 15-minute cycles, and so SWS and REM sleep will switch off with each other. As I already mentioned, but just to reinforce it, REM sleep is characterized by rapid eye movement, and during REM sleep, it's fascinating to note that there is very high cortical activity, specifically within the motor cortex. And so within the motor cortex, you're going to have levels of activity that resemble waking activity. And that might seem a little bit counterintuitive because you might recall that I mentioned during REM sleep, you're going to have atonia or loss of muscle tone. But just because your muscles themselves aren't moving doesn't mean that there isn't high electrical activity in the motor cortex of your brain. It just means that that electrical activity in your brain is not going to then get translated into actual muscle activity. Another structure in the brain that I would like to highlight for its importance in REM sleep is the brainstem, which is depicted and highlighted at the right over here. And the brainstem has several important functions in REM sleep. The first is that the brainstem contains a lot of critical nuclei, like, for example, a structure called the reticular activating system, or RAS for short, that are responsible for essentially initiating REM sleep in the brain. So the brainstem, it controls a lot of critical functions, like, for example, breathing and swallowing and facial movements and all of that, but it's also very important for initiating REM sleep through this reticular activating system. Another thing that's important to note about the brainstem is that the brainstem is responsible for essentially shutting off the communication of electrical signals from the motor areas of the brain to the spinal cord, to the muscles. So the reason that you can have high electrical activity in the motor cortex of the brain, but also have a loss of muscle tone and atonia, is that the brainstem is essentially going to shut off communication from the brain to your muscles. Additionally, the brainstem is important for regulating basic functions during REM sleep to ensure that you're still breathing during REM sleep. So once again, those are some of the critical functions of the brainstem, and they will persist during REM sleep. Additionally, there is some consideration of the possibility that the brainstem might be involved in actually initiating and coordinating dreaming during REM sleep. However, the actual mechanics of how dreams occur during REM sleep is still widely debated and widely investigated. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to look into some of the latest research on that, because it's still a very active area of investigation in neuroscience. Next, I would like to dive a little bit more into neurotransmitters and how different actual structures within the brain are responsible for initiating and organizing sleep. So a very important network within the brain is the orexin network. Orexin is a neuropeptide within the brain, and one of the two different types of orexins is depicted at the bottom left here. And orexin neurons, or neurons that produce orexin, primarily exist within a region of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is highlighted in red here. And within the hypothalamus, these orexin neurons are going to be critically important for determining when you fall asleep, and also managing cycles of slow wave sleep and REM sleep, as well as your energy levels throughout the day. So orexin is a critical center basically for managing all things related to sleep and energy levels. And because orexin sits at the center of this very important network, there's a lot of signaling to other regions of the brain to coordinate the onset of sleep. And some of these important brain structures include, for example, the amygdala, the thalamus, and the brainstem. And so the reason that there's coordination with the amygdala is that the amygdala, because it's responsible for a lot of your emotional processing and your fight or flight response, the amygdala is critical as an arousal center within the brain. And so regulating arousal is, of course, going to be important for your actual sleep cycles. And the thalamus is just generally involved in any critical processes related to the intake of sensory information. And so, of course, your levels of sensation are going to change when you're transitioning from being awake to being asleep. And I've already covered how the brainstem is important for the coordination of REM sleep. And so orexin is going to signal to the brainstem when it's time to start transitioning to sleep. Some other important brain structures include the forebrain, the basal ganglia, which is involved in movement, and so of course your levels of movement are going to change during sleep, and other regions of the hypothalamus, like for example neurons that are responsible for releasing histamine, which is another neurotransmitter that's important in regulating arousal levels in the brain, are also going to be very important within this orexin network. So that's just a bit of an overview on some of the brain structures that are critical for actually initiating and regulating levels of energy and sleep. To dive a little bit deeper into the balance of neurotransmitters, the levels of neurotransmitters within your brain are going to also be critical for controlling when you actually go into sleep. And so just to briefly cover some of the neurotransmitters and the levels of neurotransmitters that are important in sleep, when you're awake, we tend to exhibit high acetylcholine because acetylcholine is critical for acting at neuromuscular junctions and promoting as well as inhibiting voluntary muscle movements. And so when you're doing a lot of movement while you're awake, acetylcholine is going to be very important. Norepinephrine is also going to be very high while you're awake because norepinephrine, which is closely related to epinephrine or adrenaline, is going to increase levels of arousal and activity while you're awake. Meanwhile, during slow wave sleep, you're not going to be moving as much and you're not going to be particularly alert, so both acetylcholine and norepinephrine are very low. However, during REM sleep, you are still going to have higher levels of acetylcholine in order to allow for things like rapid eye movement. And you're going to have lower epinephrine because, once again, while you're asleep, you're not going to be very alert. Now I'd like to dive a little bit more into circadian rhythms and what actually controls your transitions between being awake and being asleep. We've talked a lot about the different cycles within sleep, like SWS and REM sleep, but now I want to move a little bit more into talking about your actual cycling between being asleep and being awake. A very important center, once again, within the hypothalamus for controlling your circadian rhythms is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN for short. Once again, that's just this bundle of neurons within the hypothalamus. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus is very important because it intakes light to know when you should be asleep and when you should be awake. And so this light input from your eyes is going to tell your suprachiasmatic nucleus when it's daytime and you should be awake and alert, and when it's nighttime and when you should be sleeping. And so people who work the night shift might have a lot of trouble at first transitioning to having higher energy during their shift at night because their suprachiasmatic nucleus needs to adjust to the fact that they need to be alert when they're receiving signals that it's dark outside, and that they need to then rest and recover when it's light outside, even though it's daytime. And also, when you experience jet lag, the difference in time zones and light signals will cause you to feel fatigue when you are supposed to be awake, and might cause you to feel more alert when you should be trying to sleep. So just to give a little bit of an overview, light signals go to your eyes, will cross through the optic nerves and go to your hypothalamus, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus will receive these light signals, and then based on these light signals, the suprachiasmatic nucleus will relay signals to other structures in the brain. There are a lot more that are covered in this diagram, but the three main ones I would like to highlight are the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, which is also in the hypothalamus, and based on signaling from the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, or VLPO for short, will release inhibitory neurotransmitters like GABA and galanin, and so when there's more inhibitory neurotransmitters, there's going to be a reduction in your levels of alertness. And so the VLPO is very important for decreasing levels of alertness in the brain when you're transitioning from being awake to being asleep. Additionally, as I mentioned before, orexin, very important for regulating these sleep-wake cycles, and so there's a lot of coordination between the SCN and orexin neurons, and because your forebrain is going to be responsible for a lot of your cortical activity, there's going to be a lot of communication between the SCN and the forebrain as well. And so just to end this lecture, I thought I'd show you guys a really cool video that is basically showing how there's different levels of neuronal activity and firing within the hypothalamus in order to regulate these sleep-wake cycles. So that might just be fun to see how in real time your neurons are firing and getting polarized and hyperpolarized very rapidly, just so that there can be really synchronized signaling to control your sleep-wake cycle. So hopefully you guys enjoy that video, and thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope that you guys learned a lot from this video, and stay tuned for future uploads about neuroscience and all things related to the brain.